Hello all sentient beings and welcome to Transmissions Alt Mode, where we talk all news, comics, and media related to the... On this special episode of Transmissions Alt Mode, we sit down with Brian Ruckley, writer of the new Transformers comic book series from IDW. We explore his approach to rebooting the Transformers universe and what he's got in store for the reimagining of our favorite Autobots and Decepticons. So sit back and enjoy the beginning of a bold new era on this episode of Transmissions Alt Mode.
Welcome to Transmissions, the podcast that hasn't picked an alt mode yet. I'm your host, Charles, aka Big C, and I'm joined by the excellent Transmissions team. Jeremy, aka Yakko.
Hello, how you doing?
And Daryl, the Cybertronian beast.
Hey, what's happening? Let's talk Transformers.
All right, and this is a very special episode because we are doing a really special interview. We're pleased to welcome Mr. Brian Ruckley to join us on Transmissions. Brian is the writer of the new Transformers comic series from IDW starting this March 2019. Brian is an author of several fantasy novels and other comics from IDW set in the Rogue Trooper and Highlander worlds. Now he embarks on architecting the newest iteration of the Transformers universe in comic form. Thank you, Brian, for sitting down with us today.
That's my pleasure. No problem at all.
Yeah, this is an interesting feeling for us because it's not every day that the Transformers universe gets rebooted. So we're curious to talk to the person behind that.
Well, yeah, imagine what an interesting feeling it is for the writer who's having to do the rebooting.
So maybe we can start off just by getting to know you a little bit. So can you tell us, just a little bit about yourself and what you did before becoming an author?
Oh, well, before I was a writer, I spent about, 10 or 15 years working mostly actually in sort of environmental nature conservation type jobs. My background was quite sciencey, and I went in an environmental direction with that. And to be honest, if the writing thing hadn't worked, I would have been quite happy to carry on with that in a lot of ways, really. But, the writing was always there as something that, was at least at the back of my mind as something I wanted to do. And eventually I just got lucky, I guess you say, and it worked. So I haven't had a proper job in a little while.
Oh, cool. Well, how did you first get into writing professionally?
I'm one of those really irritating people who, I wrote a couple of short stories and I sold a couple of short stories over the years. And I was always thinking about it. And I eventually just reached the point where I thought, okay, if I don't give this novel thing a go, I'm never going to, actually be able to stop thinking about it, sort of thing. So I wrote a novel as you do at that point in my spare time and weekends and everything, and just sent it off to some agents and got picked up by one of the first agents I sent it to, and they started sending it round publishers, and I was lucky enough to get picked up by one of the first few publishers they sent it to. So to be honest, it sounds terrible, but it was a relatively painless experience from my point of view.
Well, that's pretty cool. I mean, I'm sure it must have taken a lot of work on your part to write a novel in your spare time while you're holding down the day job, and then just.
Oh, it's in a lot of ways it's terrible because you've not got any deadline either, so you never finish the damn thing until you finally reach breaking point and think, I can't do this anymore. I've got to just send it out.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I can't remember exactly how much time I spent on that first novel, but it was about 2 or 3 times as much as I spent on any novels after that.
Yeah. So maybe, I did see on your website you have the Godless World trilogy. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about that series and maybe just a little bit about some of your other books. And I guess they're all in the fantasy genre?
Yeah, more or less. I've had 5 novels, the first 3 of which are in the Godless World trilogy. And that's pretty straight up sort of swords and magic fantasy in a fantasy world. What people sometimes call a big fat fantasy trilogy. But it is kind of, it's sort of loosely based on the sort of landscapes and the cultures and so on of Scotland to a certain extent, or at least Northern Europe. And it was all quite wintry and bloody and violent and so on. And after that, I did a couple of standalone novels, one of which was actually the most recent one I published was, again, sort of fairly traditional sort of magic and fantasy action, heroic fantasy type stuff. The other one I did was called The Edinburgh Dead, which is actually a kind of mashup of sort of historical detective fiction and horror and stuff that's all based on real life or real history, stuff that went on in Edinburgh in the 18th and 19th centuries with Burke and Hare. You've probably heard of Burke and Hare, who are so famous as body snatchers and murderers who were selling corpses to the anatomy schools in Edinburgh back then. And I've always been kind of into that bit of history, so I did a version of it that involved all sorts of horrific goings on and zombie dogs and all sorts of things.
Oh, interesting. Well, I have to check those out. So I did look at your website, but I'm behind on my fantasy literature reading, so maybe this is the motivation to get back into it.
Well, they're not exactly inaccessible or anything like that. Maybe try one of the standalone books. The two standalones are called The Edinburgh Dead and The Free, and they're not too long or anything, so they can be quite snappy reads.
Mm-hmm. Cool. And so, how did you get into writing comics?
This is another one of these things that makes me sound bad, because I got lucky again. When the Godless World trilogy came out, I got a fan email from someone who was just emailing me to say, how much they'd enjoyed the books. And at the end of the email, they happened to mention that they worked for a comic company and had I ever thought about writing comics, which, I mean, to be honest, I hadn't really thought all that much about writing comics, but I was for years and years and years, I've been a huge comics fan. I'm actually sitting now surrounded by bookcases that are loaded down with graphic novels, and I've still got cupboards full of single issue comics from back in my teenage years and stuff. So, it turned out that an editor at IDW was a fan of my novels and was asking me if I'd ever thought about writing comics. So obviously I said yes. And one thing led to another, and I ended up being invited to pitch for the Rogue Trooper comic that I ended up doing for them, which also, I mean, that kind of was the perfect thing, because, that's a property from 2000 AD, the British anthology science fiction comic, which was a huge thing in my childhood. Was one of the formative reading experiences of my childhood, was reading 2000 AD and, Rogue Trooper and Judge Dredd and all these characters that came out of that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's something I'm not too familiar with, but I do hear a lot of my friends in the UK talk very fondly about those comics.
Oh, I mean, it's impossible, particularly in America, where, I mean, you guys have been spoiled for choice with comics for decades, but 2000, it's impossible to overstate how significant 2000 AD was for a huge, at least one generation of sort of British kids. It was a really formative experience for anybody who was interested in science fiction and all that sort of stuff, especially Judge Dredd, but all sorts of other stuff that was in it as well.
Mm-hmm. So So you've had some nice success writing both books and comics. So how does from your perspective, how does the process of scripting comics differ from writing a novel?
Oh boy. Well, I should probably whisper this, but I don't suppose my any book publishers are going to be listening. But I actually prefer writing comics to writing novels. But it's a totally different, the writing muscles you're using are just completely different, because I think it's kind of a cliche to say it, but comic scripting is much more like, sort of TV screenwriting or something than it is writing prose in a lot of ways. And it's the pressure on you to sort of be economic with your dialogue and so on is just completely different discipline than what you get when you're writing a novel. Because obviously when you're writing a novel, you want every word to be there for a reason, and the whole self-editing process in novels tends to be sort of cutting out huge swathes of text and shortening everything as much as anything. But it's a whole different ballgame when you get into writing a comic, and the only direct means you have as a writer of communicating with the reader is the actual dialogue. And you have to be so tight with it just because, the nature of the medium, the art has to have all the room to breathe you can possibly give it, really, given that it's a visual medium. So you have to be so tight with conveying information and character and mood and, exposition, whatever you want to get in there. If you want to get it across to the reader directly, it has to be in the actual dialogue as concisely as possible. But you also have to be sort of communicating effectively enough with the artist that they can sort of convey their information to the reader as well, because so much of it in a comic isn't what I write. It's what the artist does, hopefully the artist understands what we're trying to get across. And if you're lucky to have good artists, which we have on this Transformers book, they can do so much of the work, and they in a lot of ways it's the artists who are communicating most directly with the readers. And the whole team thing is, to be honest, it's one of my favorite things about the comics writing compared to the novel writing. Because, back when I was trying to write that first novel on my evenings and weekends, I was sitting in my poky little flat somewhere, tapping away on the keyboard in the dark on my own sort of thing for months and months and months. And you get no feedback. You've got nothing finished until you finish the whole book sort of thing. But with comics, the sheer buzz of the whole process being so much faster and so much more compressed and so much more sort of interactive, because, there really isn't many things better as a writer than getting up in the morning, switching on your email and getting emails with sort of JPEGs of pencils or finished art or whatever coming in. And that's constant kind of back and forth. That flow is something you just don't get with writing prose and novels and stuff. So it's a real buzz, and it's definitely makes you feel slightly less lonely.
Very cool. So it sounds like you've developed a pretty good relationship with the new artists on the book.
Well, it's going, touch wood, it's going very well so far. I mean, this is quite a tough gig that the artists have got. I think it sounds like the kind of thing I would say, but I do think sort of pretty much without exception, as far as I can think, all the artists on the IDW Transformers books so far have been really good. And the ones on this book are great. And it's a tough gig they've got, because, you're working with characters that aren't human, obviously, and don't even necessarily have particularly expressive faces or anything, and you've still got to convey all this action and emotion and the character interactions and so on. And particularly with this book being bi-weekly. Oh, what do you call it? Bi-weekly is the correct term. Everyone gets confused about this. Fortnightly, whatever. The artists and the editors, this is fine for me, as people often say, the writer has the easiest job on a comic because it doesn't take all that long to put together a comic script and so on. But for the editors and artists working on a fortnightly book, that's a pretty punishing schedule, and they've got to be really on their game to keep everything flowing, which so far, it's worked really well.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk a little bit about your history with Transformers. So, first of all, are you a fan of Transformers? Like, what is your history with the toys, the comics, the TV show, the movies? Have you been into that for, before you got into the writing the comic?
So that depends on your definition of the word fan, which is, fan is not as simple a word as it used to be when I was growing up. I've always liked Transformers. I'm a fan in the sense that I've always been aware of them, and things like the movies, some of the cartoons and so on. I've always been watching some of it, but I wouldn't claim to have been kind of an expert or anything for most of that time. The one bit of it, I mean, it sounds a bit corny and like I'm trying to curry favor with my bosses now, but the one thing that I was an unreserved fan of, and that I genuinely was reading as a fan long before I ever knew this opportunity might come up, were the IDW Transformers comics, which when somewhat at random, to be honest, I just thought they looked interesting, and I knew they were getting quite a good press, as it were. So I gave them a try, and I was honestly blown away by what this was, particularly, More Than Meets the Eye and Robots in Disguise. It was back then, more or less at the start of those runs. And I really didn't think I'd ever read licensed comics that were as good as they were, just as, setting aside the question of, being about Transformers and the cool characters and all that, but just as comics in terms of the quality of the writing and the plotting and the art and all this sort of thing. I was just blown away. And then, of course, when this, I wasn't current, I was reading these as, trade paperback collections, so, because I'm not really current on any comics nowadays, to be honest. It sounds terrible, but there's just too many of them. So I do most of my reading in sort of trade paperback collections, months or years behind the current publishing schedule. But then I did this thing, which also happened to me when I was writing the novels, really, is that as soon as I knew this opportunity was coming up and I was involved in sort of pitching and so on for this comic series, I more or less stopped consuming Transformers material, for at least a while. I will get back to it. But, I've got this thing where, particularly when you're asked to be doing a reboot and stuff, I kind of, I have this gut reaction that I actually don't want to be seeing too much of what everyone else has done beyond what I already know, sort of thing. Just because I know that if I was still sort of avidly consuming the Transformers comics and cartoons right now, I'd be sort of constantly finding things that I thought I ought to include and things that suddenly struck me as better than anything I could ever do and all this sort of thing. So I just end up confusing myself, which is exactly what happened when I started writing fantasy novels, because I was an avid fantasy reader before that. But as soon as I was actually writing the things, my fantasy reading fell off dramatically. So yeah, I mean, I knew a fair amount about the Transformers before I got involved in this. But I wouldn't have called myself a hardcore fan or anything like that.
Okay. Well, so basically you heard, that IDW was doing a reboot and you were able to like just pitch to them directly? Is that how you got the new job?
Yeah. I mean, with anything like this, when when they've got a series planned, of any sort, the editors, this is actually the editors on this book are actually not the same editors I've worked with before. But, it's one of those sad truths that contacts matter to a certain extent, and you have to be known to the right people to a certain extent to get yourself on the invite list when an opportunity comes up. So, I've no idea actually how it worked in practice, but I was just invited. I was asked if I was interested in the Transformers, and I said absolutely yes. And I was invited to pitch, outline ideas for what a reboot would look like if I got my hands on it.
Mm-hmm. Very cool. And I just want to, so there's been some discussion online on various Transformers groups, but I just want to be clear because we want to make sure this is directly from the creator, that this is a full reboot. There's no connection to the previous continuity or universe. It's a completely new universe starting fresh, right?
Yes, it is. I was, the sort of terms of the project that I was invited to pitch for were very specifically, no connection, no carryover from what's gone before. We're starting, not exactly from square one, given what enormous franchise the Transformers is, and you can't change some of the absolute basics. Like you can't have them not come from Cybertron or that sort of thing. But in effect, yes, it was starting from square one, and coming up with some kind of take that would be a bit fresh, a bit different from everything that's gone before. Cause to be honest, I couldn't do what people like John Barber and James Roberts were doing, in their series any better than they've already done it. So, even from my point of view, that it wouldn't be terribly appealing to be trying to exactly replicate or carry on what they'd done, because I wouldn't be able to do it any better than they did on those series anyway. So, a reboot's kind of, it's what IDW and Hasbro wanted, and it's very much the kind of thing that I like as well.
Mm-hmm.
Despite some of the, the explicit stating of that in solicits and stuff, reading comprehension is very high among fans.
Well, but you can sympathize with that to some extent. It's a funny thing, actually. I was thinking about it the other day, because there's a certain natural suspicion, even I as a comics fan and a comics reader, I have a natural suspicion when some comics companies who shall remain nameless say we're having a reboot, we're having a relaunch. They've got so many different words.
Or you kill
none
a
of which,
like,
yeah. So, it's so hard to tell sometimes what comics publishers are actually up to, even when they're saying words like relaunch or reboot. But it's one of the well, this might be giving hostages to fortune, might all go horribly wrong, but as far as I can see, it's one of the absolute best things about the Transformers franchise, and indeed the Transformers fandom, is that there is actually a genuine tradition within this franchise of having reboots and, having hard resets and coming up with completely different continuities and different versions of the characters and the stories and everything. So in a lot of ways, I do hope that it's a fandom that's actually much more receptive to the idea of having a real genuine hard reboot, telling a new version of the story, that genuinely does not connect and isn't tied into the previous versions, because we're not kidding about that. There's no hidden sort of connections and so on. There'll be all kinds of echoes, but it is genuinely starting the story, telling a new version of it. And that's not the kind of thing you get in superhero comics, for example, where everybody tends to be terribly hung up on, continuity, what's canon, what's not. You can't change this, you can't change that. It's all got to fit together and make sense somehow. But I think the whole thing around Transformers is a bit more flexible and open-minded than that in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and that's definitely something we're looking forward to is seeing what's going to be, what this new iteration will be, and what how everything takes shape within this within this new Transformers universe. So that's something that's always, I think, exciting from a fan's perspective and within the Transformers stories.
Yeah, I hope so.
Just a quick aside. So you mentioned the 2000 AD comics as an influence. Did you actually read any of the Marvel UK Transformers comics back in the day?
Some one or two, not regularly. I mean, to be honest, when I was reading, when I kind of progressed beyond not beyond's the wrong word because it makes it sound like a step up or something. When I started reading American comics, or when I started reading comics beyond 2000 AD, I did the cliched thing of falling for superheroes hook, line and sinker. So I was pretty much a Marvel and DC superhero comic reader after that for a long time. Mm-hmm. And I really didn't read very much UK comics at all.
Okay. So one thing, you mentioned already that the new series is going to be a bi-weekly or fortnightly, I should say, series. So does that put, I mean, you mentioned how that is demanding for the artist, for the writer too. I mean, is it also difficult to keep a schedule for that so you've got to basically have 24 stories in a year ready to go?
Well, that's the theory. Yeah. That's, barring unforeseen developments, that's the plan. Yeah. I mean, it is genuinely much easier for the writer than it is for the artist or for the editors. 'Cause there's just the time pressure that they have to work under is much higher. But I mean, so far it's not been a problem from my end. And, so long as we can stay ahead of the schedule, ahead of the game, then it's fine from the writing point of view. I can see it, if things start going wrong, and I mean, I don't really believe in writer's block, but you can imagine if you get yourself stuck in a horrible hole that you just can't think your way out of plot wise or something like that, then it could all start to get a bit more tense. But, no, from the writing point of view, it's perfectly doable.
Mm-hmm. And is that I mean, I think it's probably pretty open-ended, but is that the plan going forward, is to keep it, twice monthly for the foreseeable future?
As far as I know, yes. I don't, unless I've missed an email or something, nobody's told me that there's any particular sort of plan to stop doing that at any specific stage. I mean, I wouldn't want to say it's impossible, but it strikes me as slightly unlikely that you could keep that up for 5 years or something like that. But certainly, as far as I know, the plan is to go for it for the foreseeable future. Okay.
So what excites you about creating stories in the Transformers universe, and what drew you to that? You mentioned you fell in love with More Than Meets the Eye and Robots in Disguise, and we have as well. So I'm curious what your motivation is for jumping into the Transformers universe.
Well, there's a lot that I think is extremely and unusually appealing about it all. I think, I mean, even before I was involved in these comics, and to be honest, even before I'd read the other IDW stuff, I've always thought there's a really strong, just basic visual appeal of so many of these characters. They just are enormously sort of striking and visually appealing if you're kind of susceptible to that kind of thing. So there's an enormous visual appeal to it, which fits beautifully, obviously, with comics. But I think, when you saw the stuff that was going on in More Than Meets the Eye and Robots in Disguise and all of that, it's so screamingly obvious that there's so many different things you can do with these characters and this universe and, this basic setup. Whether it's, you can do I was going to say domestic comedy, but that's not quite the right word, but you sort of know what I mean with the more than meets the eye, lost light kind of, really quite, small scale, at least at times, very based on relationships and a lot of humor, a lot of, emphasis on the characters and their interactions. But you can also, you can use exactly the same characters and the same setting and even to some extent the same sort of storylines to do, big dramatic epic science fiction. And it's one of these almost open-ended sandbox universes where the whole premise of the franchise in a sense is that this is a vast universe and a vast cast of characters and a vast story that takes place over, X thousand million years or whatever. So the range of scales of stories that you can do in there, from the really quite intimate all the way to the galaxy spanning, millennia spanning stuff, is really unusual actually when you think about it, because most franchises, most sets of characters and so on are kind of geared to doing one or maybe two types of stories. But the whole Transformers thing is just, it's got so much more scope within it to do your own, pick your kind of approach, pick your tone, pick your scale, and just go for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Just to get a little deeper into how you started crafting the series, at least we've noticed some of the art that's been shown online seems to indicate that it is like at least visually it's drawing from the current toy line. I mean, it is Hasbro does license these out to promote its toys, so it's not shocking that you'd see like the newest toy line that they've recently put out focuses on the war for Cybertron. So clearly it looks like those character designs are being used in your comic as well. Has Hasbro kind of asked you to focus on particular sets of characters that are coming out, or have you how is Hasbro or Hasbro through IDW worked with you to craft where your series fits in to their vision and which characters you focus on, or has it been pretty hands off for you?
It's mostly been very hands off. To a certain extent, the way the characters are depicted in the comic is slightly above my pay grade, but as I understand it, yes, most of the depictions are going to be based on effectively where there's a recent toy or an upcoming toy, then that will be at least the starting point, if you like, for a depiction. In terms of the actual sort of cast and how that fits together with Hasbro's interests and priorities, they've actually been incredibly sort of flexible and open-ended about almost everything to do with the series, and they genuinely, the whole thing of this does not have to explicitly and specifically tie in a continuity sense with other stuff that's going on. But I mean, they obviously don't want it to contradict any of that too extremely. But the cast is a kind of a mixture, the way it's worked out, of some characters that I particularly wanted to include because they're particular favorites of mine, or there are particular things I wanted to do with them, and some reflection absolutely of current toy lines and so on. But none of it's been at all prescriptive, to be honest, really. It's been a fairly easygoing and straightforward process, sort of fitting different bits and different interests together. And I don't think the one thing that I think came from Hasbro and IDW, and some extent me as well, was trying as far as you can to not get too carried away with having a vast cast right from the start, because there is a temptation when you've got so many cool characters and, you've got so many ideas for things you could do with lots of these characters. You could really go overboard, and I think everyone involved wanted this series to be something that, long-time fans like you guys could find stuff in and see stuff in, hopefully some stuff you haven't seen before, but also something that would be accessible to people who maybe aren't quite as familiar with all the stories that have been told and all the characters that have been used in, not just comics, but all sorts of other Transformers media. So to a considerable extent, I've tried to keep the cast relatively focused, at least early on, and it's, it gradually opened, well, not that gradually, but it does open out quite a bit as we go through the issues. But keeping that core cast fairly focused early on was quite important, and some of that cast is undeniably sort of a reaction to the current toy line. Some of it's ones I wanted to have in there. So hopefully it's a healthy mix that balances everybody's interests and priorities.
Cool. And you mentioned you stopped reading the previous series when you were focusing on pitching the new stories. So do you have I guess in your particular new vision, how are you I guess it's a difficult balance to try and really avoid retreading previous ground and going in a different direction. So how mindful or conscious are you of that when you're crafting the new stories, and how have you found that difficult, or has it been relatively easy to make a separation?
Well, the first thing is I rely on my excellent editors to tell me if I start repeating something too horribly precisely, just because I don't know that it's been done somewhere else or by someone else. But I don't, so far I've not had too much of an issue of sort of finding myself getting stuck in repetition. But that's partly because I'm not too worried about not exactly repeating stuff, but I'm not too worried about echoing stuff, because we do want a lot of this to be familiar in at least its outline. I'm not trying to reinvent the wheel here. We're trying to put a new spin on it, if you like, and tweak various things. So there will be stuff that is kind of similar to, or sounds vaguely familiar to people who know all the past stories, even if this is a slightly different version of it. But I will hopefully not be directly repeating anything. And if I inadvertently start doing that, I'm sure people will tell me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Starscream might probably end up betraying Megatron at some point in your new series.
I think, well, he's Starscream. I think you might find out round about, I don't know, somewhere around issue 8 or 9, Starscream is starting from a slightly different position than he usually does.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Now I'm intrigued. So just before we go a little deeper into the new series, I was curious. I know Hasbro has got lots of different things going on, so I didn't know if maybe they were even trying to coordinate with their other media properties. Like they just recently announced a Netflix series coming out next year. Was there any communication or coordination with you for maybe having the same time frame or same time period between that series and your series, or is it just like completely not on your radar?
No, it is on the radar. There has been communication, some of which leaks down to my level, but not necessarily all of it. But again, it's not something that either we or Hasbro are sort of setting out to make precisely match up in any sort of continuity type way. But there's a degree of coordination, absolutely, about, sort of, particularly about the timing of, how the comic series might actually, we are thinking about where we might be in the comic series when that animation hits the screens and all this kind of thing. But there is, there's no particular constraints been put on us, in terms of having to match up in any particular specific ways with that other stuff.
Okay. All right. So let's talk a little bit deeper about the new series. So, before we go a little bit further, I do want to mention to all the listeners. So this, you should be listening to this after the first issue of Transformers comes out. So we actually have read the first issue. So we might get into some small spoilers for the first issue. So if you haven't read it yet or haven't picked it up, you just might want to stop the podcast, listen, or, read the comic first before you go any further. So.
Absolutely. Stop listening now.
And then restart later after you've read the comic.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Yes. Sorry, I left that bit out.
All right. So your series starts really early. It's before the war. Tensions are a little bit high, but Cybertron is still at peace. But of course, it's Transformers. At some point, there's going to be Autobots and Decepticons. There's going to be a giant war. So I was curious.
You don't know that. You can't be certain.
Okay. Fair enough. I won't.
We could have Guardians and Renegades.
Well, that's for Tom Scioli. How far have you got things mapped out? I mean, as a Transformers fan, there are certain expectations. Like, you don't have to give an answer to this. I mean, I know this would probably give away the whole deal, but, is there eventually a plan to, push the timeline forward, even going to Earth or,
So look, there is going to be a war. You're quite right.
Yes.
I don't know how you figured that out from the first issue, but you're quite right. And I know how we get from the first issue to the outbreak of war. Mm-hmm. Well, I'm not going to say how long that's going to take. But it'll take a little while to get to the outbreak of war. As far as the Earth thing is concerned, I, at the moment, have made no specific proposal and haven't been asked for a specific proposal for how or when, there would be any Cybertronians showing up on Earth. Which isn't to say that, I don't have ideas about how that might come about and so on and when it might come about, but it's not part of the it's not part of my currently projected, plans that I've actually got sketched out in my head. So although it absolutely can, and I imagine will happen at some point, it's some way down the line as far as I'm concerned at the moment.
Okay. So how far ahead are you in writing? Like in terms of issues, are you on like issue 6 now or?
Funnily enough, I did some issue 6 today. Yeah. But I've done a bit of 7 as well. So, and I've been, I haven't actually scripted beyond 7, but I have what you would call extensive notes and an outline and all this kind of thing. So in terms of where my head's at, it's in the second arc of the story at the moment. But I do actually have sort of third, fourth arcs somewhere in my head. I just haven't written them down yet.
Something that we've noticed as we review comics is that comic writing has become much more of a written for arcs, as opposed to every now and then, you have just one-off issues that just almost mean very little to the ongoing story, but everything nowadays seems to be written for the trade. Is that something that you've come across and have noticed as well, Brian? Or is that something that you've been told to do, is write in arcs that can be transposed to trades?
I don't actually remember whether I was explicitly told to do it, but I mean, I'd be crazy. I don't think anyone can deny that you're right, that a lot of comics are written in arc form. And I think that's partly, a response to the sort of rise of the trades. I think it's partly a response to, I think it started, a while back, partly because a lot of writers were coming into comics who were, I think, quite consciously trying to do comics as TV sort of thing. They were very influenced by the sort of structure and rhythms of TV, serialized TV. And I think that had a slight effect in terms of making people want to write slightly longer form stories, that, because of the way comics work, tended to fall into 4 or 5 or 6 or whatever issue arcs. So it absolutely does happen. And I kind of, as I say, I can't remember whether that was actually an instruction. I'm not sure it was for this in particular, but it's kind of the way I naturally approach it anyway. But I can, if it's any comfort to you, I can say we are absolutely going to have, single issue standalones that, do relate to the overall plot as well as arcs. So
that does come from me, actually, because I mean, and don't you think I missed the joke you made about me, Jeremy? I got that I don't read well, but I did catch that.
What? No, that was a comment to someone on Facebook.
Oh well, I got that too. But in the past, I have been, people have told me that I don't generally get the Transformers books because they go over my head, and that's true. All of them were written very deep, and I'm much more akin to a very action-packed book. And when everything's written for the trade, you get very long stories, very drawn-out stories, and generally the middle of these arcs are very boring for me. So they're always full of a lot of exposition and very little action. So when everything is starting to go to writing for the trade, it becomes I want to read the beginning, I want to read the end, and then the middle is just, I can almost put it away because I know it's just going to be exhibition for stuff that's going to come later. But I'm very happy to hear that you're going to have some one-off issues here that are going to be almost written just for me.
Well, yeah, you tell yourself that if it makes you feel
I'm gonna
absolutely.
That's what I'm gonna say. I'm saying, oh, here's the issue Brian wrote for me. Thanks.
Fine. I'm okay with that.
All right, getting back on track. So in issue 1 we meet Rubble. So he's a newly born Cybertronian. He's our point of view character.
He's mine.
Yes. He's a completely new character. He's not a previously used character. I guess it feels like you're using him as a way to give us to help us as the readers learn, I guess, the ground rules for the Transformers in this new universe. Would that be a fair statement?
Yeah, sure. There's a significant amount of that in there. Yes. He has, he's there for particular, reasons to do with the plot as well, which will become more apparent in future issues. But yeah, absolutely. The idea of having, a character who's discovering the world is a kind of obvious and easy way to create that impression of not only this is seeing something through fresh eyes, but giving you a nice excuse to do a bit of exploring of some of the wonders and the strangeness and all that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. And we've already got a little bit of a tidbit because it seems that new Cybertronians get to pick their alt mode. So that's an interesting wrinkle that you've introduced. So that makes me hopeful that we'll actually get Rubble, maybe a redesign in the near future, even a new name. I don't know. So that's, I'm just curious about the journey we're going to take Rubble on.
Yeah. Well, that's what I want all readers to feel like. So you just carry on feeling curious and we'll see where it goes.
I guess related to that, do you have a notion of Cybertronians having a quote unquote childhood? Is that do you see that Rubble exploring that, or is it?
Well, yeah. I mean, it's a bit of a grey area because I mean, visually, Angel Hernandez, I think, has done a lovely little design with Rubble, because obviously that's, all the visual side of things is very much not my area of expertise, but it's a lovely design because it does have something slightly childlike about the design. But from the general point of view, he's certainly written, I hope it comes across, to be a bit naive, a bit, childish isn't quite the right word, but he's new. He's innocent. Yeah, exactly. So if Cybertronians have a childhood, then I think it's not really a physical childhood as much as a psychological one, where their minds perhaps take a bit of time to mature, and to get a sort of more adult grasp on the world around them and how it all works.
Mm-hmm. And we also noticed in this first issue there's some non-robotic life on Cybertron. So will we see more of that going forward?
Yeah. The
Voin scavengers are the ones we
saw.
Saw.
Yeah, there's some other varieties of organic life knocking around the planet as well. But the Voin are going to show up in a few issues here and there. But I think within the next few, quite early in the next few issues, you'll see a few other examples of organic life that's hanging around doing various different things on Cybertron.
Mm-hmm. And we noticed that at least the Voin scavengers, they look, at least except for the, I guess, octopus floaty thing, the animals looked a little bit ape-like, but it reminded us of, I guess, a character from the old G1 cartoon named Primacron. I don't know if your head went that way at all, or if there's any, or if that's just a coincidence.
No, that's basically a coincidence. I'll tell you, the deal with the Voin is actually that the squiddy thing in the globe is the Voin, and at some point I'll explain this in the comic, but I'll spoil it for you guys. The ape-like, somewhat ape-like things are kind of organic, genetically engineered, slaved organisms that, although they look a bit like apes, they're not really sentient in themselves. They're sort of subservient to the squid thing in the globe. They're like its hands, effectively.
Oh, interesting. All right. Well, you've made me curious about that too. So I guess we'll have to keep reading for that.
It is neat to see some more kind of unique sci-fi elements that I guess haven't been in Transformers show up.
Well, I think it's something I'm quite keen to do. I mean, it's going to be kind of bit by bit rather than bang, 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 but I'm quite keen to get little bits here and there that just say, this is science fiction and it can be quite weird sometimes, and it can be quite epic and big scale and all this kind of thing. So there'll be little bits here and there, probably gradually building up as we go, that, draw on the sort of limitless possibilities of the kind of stuff you can have going on in a science fiction universe.
Mm-hmm. And we did, of course, again, it's no surprise that we see Optimus, well, not Optimus Prime, but Orion Pax and Megatron.
Yes.
As very familiar characters in the Transformers universe.
Yeah.
So one thing that I did notice, and it seems it's very conspicuous, is that there don't really seem to be any faction symbols on anyone except for Orion Pax. So we see an Autobot symbol on his shoulder, and Megatron does call him an Autobot. But Megatron is not a Decepticon. He's an Ascenticon, or he's leading the Ascenticons.
Yes. He's the sort of de facto leader of the Ascenticons, yes.
Yeah, so I guess I'm curious if we're going to get into more about the meanings behind those faction symbols, and will they be very prominent in the series?
Eventually there will be very prominent faction symbols for sure, yeah. There are some other characters knocking around in due course who have the Autobot symbol at this stage, but the idea with the factions at the moment is that things aren't quite as they sometimes are in the Transformers universe, not yet anyway. So there is absolutely an Autobot faction, and there is an Ascenticon faction, and there are one or two other factions involved in politics and so on Cybertron, but there are no Decepticons
yet.
Well, you said that. I didn't say that.
I guess it's also interesting to see, because it does make it clear that we are in a new universe here, because Optimus, or I should say Orion and Megatron, they are clearly not the same characters they were in the previous IDW series. So Megatron is not this gladiator miner, I guess lower class resistance fighter, and Optimus is not a police officer. They're both kind of political entities now. They're both senators serving in some governmental role on Cybertron. We do get a little, as you said, a little bit of an echo of Megatron is dissatisfied with the status quo, and he is agitating for change. So that's that it's not a surprise to see that as being a little bit of the initial genesis for the coming conflict. But it is. We also did notice that in this first issue, we had a different artist just working on that particular scene, which was I guess Cachet Whitman, who was and we're curious how, like, going forward, if we'll have kind of a parallel story in future issues, or is the series kind of a single?
No, the whole idea is to have Angel and Cachet splitting the art duties on individual issues.
Okay.
But it's all one story. But it obviously makes sense from a visual and just from a flow point of view to divide, to have them working on sort of separate scenes if you're going to change the art inside the issue. So they're not parallel stories. It is all one story. But the bulk of each issue will be Angel Hernandez, and Cachet will be doing a few pages in each issue, which will usually, will make it work by doing scene changes and stuff.
Okay. We also, I guess in previous announcements, IDW mentioned Ron Joseph. Is he no longer working on the series, or is he working on it as well?
Yeah, no, I believe he had to drop off for for reasons that were to do with personal circumstances rather than anyone on either side actually wanting him to drop off, unfortunately.
Oh, okay.
It's kind of a shame, because he was very up for it, and is obviously a very good artist. But I think Cachet was always going to be involved in the series at some point, so that involvement's just moved forward a bit, really. So it's actually been quite a smooth transition.
Okay. I guess so. I guess one additional thing to in the story. I mean, it's already been mentioned in the announcements that the initial conflict centers around a murder mystery, and we do learn the identity of the murder victim in this first issue, which was, I mean,
yes.
I'll say, reading the issue, you kind of figure out who it's going to be, and even that was a little bit of a surprise.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's not, I think most people reading the issue will realize who it's going to be. I mean, I haven't actually been keeping up with whether anyone's been speculating online about who the murder victim might be, but, given that it was announced that a murder was a significant part of the plot, it's not the kind of thing you can really make too much a surprise beyond who it actually is. So I don't know whether the identity of the victim will come as a big surprise to people or not, or a terrible disappointment, or I don't know really.
It's just interesting because I felt like it was simultaneously a kind of a nod to More Than Meets the Eye readers or fans, and also just to say, okay, we're not going in the same direction. So, you know, sorry if you were attached to that particular character.
Careful not to get into spoiler territory too much. But no, there is. I mean, to be honest, it's not. Absolutely not the main reason for what happens to happen. But there is, you know, in retrospect, it is a clean break sort of thing in a way, which wasn't uppermost in my mind when I was actually writing it. But it, you know, in hindsight, it does kind of work in that slightly symbolic way.
Yeah.
But I hope it doesn't. I hope it doesn't annoy too many people.
And I guess you also dropped, I guess, two little nuggets in this. One thing that I always appreciate in the Transformers comics is the amount of world building and kind of, you know, expanding the universe a little bit. So two little nuggets that I noticed that you dropped in this first issue were Termagax and The Rise. So
yeah.
Anything you want to say about those two things as we wrap up here?
So, well, The Rise, you'll be hearing quite a bit about The Rise over the next few issues. They're kind of not a faction exactly, but they're a bunch of Cybertronians up to no good. Termagax will actually show up eventually. But she is the actual founder of the Decepticon faction.
Okay.
So why it appears that Megatron's currently in charge of it is something that, we might get into before too long.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, I guess one thing I just wanted to quickly ask, so you mentioned, you know, you had, I guess you had been aware of Transformers before and you know, you've gotten into the comics and everything, but have you collected any of the toys? Like, do you mess around with the toys, or is that kind of?
No, I've got two. I think I've got two Transformers toys.
Okay, which ones?
Well, I'm just looking over my shoulder because embarrassingly I've forgotten what the. you might be able to tell me if I describe it. I've got one. I've got an Optimus, but the other one is, I think, a Micromaster. I think it's a movie. It's a very simple little movie, Decepticon, that's blue and turns into a helicopter. Does that ring a bell? I'm pretty sure it's a movie one.
Might be a Barricade if it's maybe, or not Barricade, Blackout. Blackout was a movie helicopter.
That might be it, yeah. I'm embarrassed I can't remember. I was given it as a present.
If Hasbro does make a Rebel figure, are you going to buy a ton?
Oh, God, that would... I'd be surprised if it ever happens, but there are... I mean, there's Rubble's not the only new Transformer I've made up for this series, so if any of them ever turned up in toy form, that would be quite remarkable, really.
I guess one thing, I mean, so I don't know how aware you are of like Transformers conventions and the fan scene. Do you have any plans?
Yeah, a bit.
Okay.
Possibly. Probably not involving trips to the US, unfortunately, at the moment. But there is stuff that goes on slightly closer to home that I am in contact with people about, shall we say. But nothing confirmed yet.
Yeah, so I guess TF Nation is the big UK convention there. So
yeah.
All right. Well, we'll keep our ears to the ground if there are any announcements about that coming. Yeah.
Well, I'd like to go. I've done conventions before for my novels and actually for the Rogue Trooper comic and stuff, and I do like it. I am quite into that sort of the whole fan culture thing, so I'm certainly not averse to it. It's just trying to make the schedule fit with family and all this kind of thing. You know what it's like.
Yeah, definitely. All right. Well, I think we've wrung you dry with all the questions here. So thank you so much for.
Oh, it's a pleasure. That was good.
And before we end things, we have a thing we do with all of our interview guests called the rapid fire questions, where we kind of give you a gauntlet of yes, no, either or questions, just to.
That's a very confrontational way of phrasing it, calling it a gauntlet.
Well, you can tell us at the end how confrontational you think it is.
If I hang up, you can draw your own conclusions about how it's going.
All right, so let's get started. Autobot, Decepticon, or Ascenticon?
Oh, that's good. Probably Autobot. It's a bit boring, isn't it? But probably.
And who is your favorite Autobot?
Well, that's changing all the time at the moment because of whenever I'm sort of writing and thinking about some character or something, I get sucked in. I'll tell you who I've got a bit of a Chromia thing going at the moment.
Okay. Transformers live action movie 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or Bumblebee? Okay.
I haven't seen 4, 5. No, have I? I might have seen 4 actually. I haven't seen 5 or Bumblebee. Is Dark of the Moon 3?
Yes.
I'll have that. Yeah, 3.
Okay. All right. You should really check out Bumblebee. It was a good one.
I know everyone says it's really good. I will go and see it I will see it at some point.
All right. More Than Meets the Eye or Lost Light, Robots in Disguise or Optimus Prime, or Till All Are One?
Pooh. If I'm totally honest, I'll be fearlessly honest. More Than Meets the Eye.
Cool. Third-party toys, yes or no?
That's not something I know I'm up on, but I will say no.
Okay. Cats or dogs?
Cats.
Coffee or tea?
Both in massive quantities.
Chicken or steak?
Steak.
Pepsi or Coke?
Not too bothered really. I can go either way on that. Slight Coke preference.
Okay. Burger King or McDonald's?
Burger King.
History or science?
Oh, that's, I would say science because that's kind of my background, but I am a major history fan as well. So I'm sort of 52% science, 48 history.
Cool. Xbox, PlayStation, or Nintendo Switch?
PC.
Well, next question is PC or Mac?
PC.
iPhone or Android?
Android.
Is there a phone app that you can't live without?
Well, I don't actually, this is going to sound like I'm a total dinosaur, but it is a conscious decision. I don't run any apps on my phone, but, I do constantly, pretty much every day, I'm using the Netflix app.
Okay. Fair enough. Marvel or DC?
Oh, God. Both. But, again, yeah, not even 51% Marvel, 49% DC.
Okay, and well, then who is your favorite superhero character? I won't specify either one, so you can pick from anywhere.
That's easy. That is Marvel. I am a complete sucker for Daredevil.
Oh, nice. Stallone or Schwarzenegger?
Schwarzenegger's movies, Stallone's acting.
Pixar or DreamWorks?
Nobody says DreamWorks to that, do they?
I think we've had a couple.
Have you really? Pixar.
Yeah, I guess DreamWorks is not a thing anymore. Maybe we should change that.
No, I'm not sure.
How to Train Your Dragon.
Yeah.
I'll tell you what. I love. I'm not making this up. I love the How to Train Your Dragon movies. I think they're fantastic. But anyway, that's beside the point. Still Pixar.
Cool. What is your guilty pleasure movie that you'll always watch whenever it's on?
Oh, I'm not sure. I wouldn't define. I'm not a great believer in guilty pleasures, to be honest. If it's a pleasure, it's a pleasure, and there's no point in feeling guilty about it. I mean, I will, anytime it's on, I will watch the Magnificent Seven, like the original cowboy version.
Nice. Star Wars or Star Trek?
Oh dear. Actually, at the moment, that probably changes over time, goes back and forth, but at the moment, I would say Star Trek.
All right. Simpsons, Family Guy, or Rick and Morty?
Probably Rick and Morty, to be honest. I like all of them, but I'm not really allowed to watch Family Guy because my wife complains if I ever put it on. So probably Rick and Morty.
Well, she complains about Family Guy, but not Rick and Morty?
Well, I don't think I tend to watch that on my tablet. But Family Guy's on TV here on whatever night it is.
Yeah. Walking Dead or Game of Thrones?
I've got no, I won't start down that. Game of Thrones. I've got a thing about Walking Dead. Never mind. Game of Thrones.
Okay. We have a sports question, but I think I should probably throw it since you're in the UK. We focus on American sports, but I can throw in.
That's right. I can do American sports.
Okay, so NFL, MLB, NHL, UFC, or NBA, and I'll also throw in I guess the
Premier League.
Premier League, yeah.
So actually, even including soccer. I don't really follow the American leagues, but as in terms of the sports, it's definitely hockey or basketball to watch as a spectator.
Mm-hmm.
Probably hockey. I was a big hockey fan for a long time, and until my local team went bust and disappeared.
You've made Daryl happy because Daryl's our Canadian host and is a big hockey fan.
No, it's by far the best spectator sport as far as I'm concerned.
Damn
anyway.
You get to see
right.
a fight and
Damn right. If you ever come to TFCon Toronto, I'm taking you to a game, Brian.
It would be if I ever did get over to a convention in the States or something, going to a hockey game and a basketball game would be quite high on my list of things to try and do.
Porsche, Ferrari, Lamborghini, or Volkswagen Beetle?
Porsche.
Nice.
Classic.
Yeah, very classic. Last question, blonde, brunette, or redhead?
Ooh, personality. No preference, so personality wins.
That's the first time we've got that answer. That's a very good answer.
Your wife must be standing right behind you.
No, but she is in the room next door.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Brian, for joining us. now that we're at the end, we definitely want to encourage everyone to pick up the new Transformers comic series. But Brian, maybe you can give us some plugs about everything else you've been working on. And also, I know you've got a podcast, so, feel free to mention that as well, and all your social media and everything. So have at it.
Oh, thank you. I do have a podcast. It's actually kind of a hangover from my previous life, my sciencey, environmentally, zoology background, actually. So I do have a podcast about strange and sometimes unpleasant, but always amazing wildlife and natural history and stuff, called The Wild Episode, which is on all the usual podcasting platforms, or you can find it at thewildepisode.com. And I am on, I have my own website at brianruckley.com. But if I'm totally honest, I'm not very good at keeping it updated and so on. But I'm on Twitter. I think the Twitter handles are at Brian Ruckley, at Brian_Ruckley, I think it is. So I can be found there. That's it, I think.
All right. And we will put links to all those in our show notes. So
that's very kind. Thank you.
Yeah. So you don't have to furiously write it down while you're listening to the show. So, thank you so much again for joining us, on Transmissions. And we are definitely looking forward to the new series. We will have a review of the issues as they come out, so look for that.
Okay. You'll have to send me an email or something to tell me whether it's safe to listen to that one.
Yeah, I guess so we have another co-host. His name is Yoshi. He's I think he's the one that's going to be harder to please. So if you satisfied him,
stuck with the 80s Marvel comics. So.
Right.
So if you satisfied him, then your comic is really good. So
well, we'll see.
Or it's just old looking.
Yeah, that would be the other approach. If it had been printed on really yellowing newsprint or something, maybe it would have been happy.
All right. Well, thank you so much again, Brian. And
thank you.
Maybe we'll have you back on in a few months to check up on things and maybe see where the series is at that point.
Yeah, sure. I'd be up for that.
Cool. And thank you everyone for listening to Transmissions. Definitely pick up the first issue of the new Transformers series, and crossing fingers that Diamond keeps up with the release schedule and really releases the books every 2 weeks, because we know you guys worked hard on them. So we've had problems in the past with the Diamond distributors sometimes delaying our beloved Transformers comics. So we're crossing our fingers that doesn't happen with the new series. And everyone be sure to pick those up and let Brian know what you think of the new series, and let us know, give us some feedback, and we will all talk to you soon. So thanks, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Later.
Hey everyone, thanks for listening to this episode of Transmissions. But just because this episode is over doesn't mean the Transformers fun has to stop. Join us and other Transformers fans on our Discord chat server by visiting transmissionspodcast.com/Discord. If you would like to learn more about how you could support the Transmissions podcast, just visit transmissionspodcast.com/support. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you again next week.